You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming at you now from a secure and well-disclosed location, it's Gary Krug with Long Waves. So thank you for joining me today. Today I've got a strange show, like any of them are not strange, but this one I'm decided to call Confronting the Denial of Rex Americana. Because it strikes me that this country, if it has a national psyche, the national psyche of big parts of it are like that of an alcoholic who won't face his drinking, who can't admit that he or she has a problem. We as a nation have a lot of trouble admitting who we are. We just can't do it. We can't actually face who we are. We can't admit that we hurt people. We never apologize. Have you noticed? The U.S. never apologizes, or almost never. George H.W. Bush famously said, "I'll never apologize for the United States." And boy, didn't the crowd go wild over that one. Yeah, USA, USA, USA. Oh, gee. Well, who never apologizes? Really? I mean, think about that for a minute. Of all the people you know, who does not apologize? Who is never wrong? Who never makes a mistake and needs to mend some fences with people who've been hurt by what one does? Jerks, abusers, madmen. It's a fairly short list of people who behave in this way. But lest you think I'm just sitting here spinning fantasies, let's consider a couple of the cases of our madness that may not seem related on the surface, but they reveal that there are some underlying patterns beneath it all. Now, interestingly, the first two examples I'm going to talk about, both are recent, and they come from Indiana, the great state of Indiana. And they've been recently in the news. And Indiana itself has gotten a bit of play of late because of its sleight of hand attempt to legalize discrimination against LGBT people in the name of defending religious freedom, right? The Religious Freedom Protection Act, or whatever they're calling it this week. Basically saying, if you're offended, if your religious convictions say you're offended by someone, you don't have to serve them, you don't have to do business with them, you can just ignore them and tell them to go away. That's what they've got a lot of play for, but there have been a couple of other stories that are extremely important that have come out of Indiana. On the one hand, they've got this religious defense of freedom, religion act, freedom, religion defending. And this is because Christians are so constantly under attack in this country, right? They're such marginalized people. Such marginalized people, right? Nah, not even. This actually smells like another one of those Fox News GOP strategies to mobilize the base with their two favorite tonics, their two favorite drinks to serve: fear and hatred. Because the fear revs the emotions and the hatred drugs the mind. Or is it the other way around? Maybe they both work. Anyway, let's get to the cases. The first case out of Indiana involves a woman who was sentenced under another draconian law in Indiana, the fetal homicide law. And this was a woman named Purvi Patel, who received a 20-year prison sentence, 20 years in prison sentence for fetal homicide and negligence. But as the story will make clear, she's actually being criminalized for having a late-term miscarriage or a stillbirth. but they've blamed her for it, and they've sentenced her to prison. Right? And the author of this, a woman named Sonali Kolhatkar, wrote this originally on Slate. It's been republished on Truthdig, says that, quote, "Some years ago, I, like millions of women, suffered a miscarriage. Mine was an intentional pregnancy, and the miscarriage occurred just a few weeks after conception. It was a bewildering and traumatic experience, after which I wanted nothing more than to be left alone to recover." So we go and look at Patel's case. The pregnancy was unintended, and the miscarriage, they think, was around 22 to 24 weeks of gestation. Right? Now, this is important because their children can't survive, even with good medical care generally, outside of the womb earlier than 24 to 28 weeks. So this is the cutoff between marriage and stillbirth. Right? So she's kind of on that line. She shows up at the hospital. She's bleeding heavily. And eventually the story comes out that she's miscarried. And she was surprised to see how developed the fetus was. And then she admitted she'd put it in a dumpster. So the police come, they interview her, no attorney. They don't even tell her she's being investigated. They don't tell her that, she has any rights. And what they're doing this whole time is they're gathering evidence to charge her. Jury deliberated 5 hours, 5 whole hours on her 2 counts. 1 count of feticide, killing a fetus before it's born, and then 1 count of negligence for killing it after it was born. Now, somebody has to explain this to me. This is the kind of logic you can only find in this expedient thinking of the wannabe born-agains, that you can charge her for feticide for killing the fetus, and then you can charge her for negligence for killing the fetus after it's born, and she's convicted of both charges. Okay. And there were other problems with this case of Purvi Patel. The prosecutors tried to prove that she had intended to terminate her pregnancy by taking abortifacients, abortion-inducing drugs. But the toxicology report didn't find any such drugs in her bloodstream. When the investigators found the fetus in the dumpster where she said she'd put it, it was pronounced dead, and yet they found a pathologist who used a test first developed in the 17th century. That would be the 1600s. A 17th century test called the lung float test to establish that the fetus had taken a breath after it emerged from the womb and was thus considered to be, however momentarily, alive. Now, this lung float test has been widely discredited, and most decent pathologists, I understand, will not use it. But, it depends on what you're trying to find and against whom. And golly gee, if you can do that, well, you can just produce all the evidence you want. So, after 24 weeks, maybe you can have a viable fetus outside of the mother, but certainly not before. And the doctors who examined the case couldn't even come to an agreement on the exact gestational age of this fetus. So 22, 24. And other than this lung float test, there was no evidence whatsoever that the fetus was born alive. So it would seem to me like the worst thing you could have charged her with, if you had to charge her at all in the midst of this tragedy of hers and this potentially life-threatening moment, you could have perhaps charged her with improper burial, but certainly not of feticide and negligence, right? But think about this for a minute. And the author makes this point rather well, Ms. Kolhatkar. If Patel's pregnancy, she writes, had been intended, if she'd obtained prenatal care, and, as is the case for 1 in every 160 pregnancies, if she suffered a stillbirth, she would likely not have been charged with anything. What the state of Indiana seems to really be punishing her for is wanting to control her own body. since text messages from her phone revealed she made an inquiry about abortion-inducing medications. But these fetal homicide laws, right, are really not, they're not rare, and they're not unique to Indiana. A number of states have these, Colorado being one of them. But what we see are these laws being used to criminalize pregnant women, especially pregnant women who are of color. In Indiana, only 2 women have been charged with feticide. Only 2. The other woman charged was a Chinese American named Beibei Shuai, who attempted suicide in a link to her pregnancy, and she was charged with feticide. So 2 women of color from immigrant backgrounds are the only 2 people who've been convicted in Indiana under this law of feticide. Now, does anybody see an issue here, a problem? Well, there are a couple. Right? On the first hand, I agree with the author's point that if she had obtained prenatal care and had been in the system and it had happened, then everybody would just be hunky-dory. Everything would have been fine. If you're in the control of the state, if you're in the medical system. But you cannot actually opt out without facing possible charges of criminal negligence or feticide or something like that. You can't opt out of the system. Yet I am drawn to the arguments of Ivan Illich, among others, who reserve for themselves the right to seek whatever health care they choose and to refuse health care they don't. That's a little different from the anti-vaxxers, and it's an argument I don't have time to go into in a lot of detail today. But the fact that she wasn't in the system is what really nailed her. The other fact was that she was from an immigrant background, a woman of color, and a woman. These are the bits that nailed her, right? And it wasn't just Indiana and the courts that nailed this woman. The media also tried and condemned her, routinely referring to the fetus as a newborn or a baby boy. One TV station, according to the article, says that they used the phrase "death of her child" in its headline. Death of her child. So across the country, we have pregnant women being arrested and imprisoned under similar laws, these fetal personhood laws. And overwhelmingly, these are women of color and poor women. So let's call it the Poor Black Women Law. Why don't we just call it that and quit pretending it's about the fetus? It's really about controlling black women, women of color, right? The judge in sentencing Patel lectured her using, quote, deeply patronizing and patriarchal language, saying that she had made choices, that she had choices you could have made that you didn't make. Choices you could have made that you didn't make. But what choices, really did she have? It's actually pretty impossible to get an abortion in Indiana, thanks to people like the judge and thanks to the right-thinking voters of the state. It's virtually impossible. There are very few abortion clinics. So, again, what we're seeing is women targeted in a variety of ways, especially black women who are then stereotyped as being promiscuous or oversexed, or they're prostitutes. And these attacks on abortion are almost a cover for these attacks on women of color in general, who are especially vulnerable. And if you are poor enough that you have no viable option for health care for your child, or no viable options for child care, then you're criminalized. This sounds to me like the work laws of Dickensian England, where you lock people up for being poor, too poor. Now, there's another angle to this story here that I want to raise, and it's important. She didn't get, Purvi Patel did not get a lot of national significance. She didn't get big organizations standing up and saying, hey, we're not going to come to Indiana if you don't quit treating poor black women in this way. In the same way that we saw LGBT people getting celebrities, big organizations to say this is wrong, we won't tolerate this kind of treatment, but we don't get it for poor black women, right? We just don't. This woman is twice marginalized. She's a woman and she's of color. Thrice marginalized, she is poor. It's not only Indiana that is at fault here, it's the whole country, which sees the battle for LGBT rights, but not the battle of this poor woman of color. Now, maybe if she had Dan Savage as an advocate or Joe Jervis, they would have gotten some traction. But poor people don't have the resources or the time and often the nous to organize in the same way that the LGBT issue can be organized. And this speaks to a need for solidarity across the range of discriminations that are inflicted on people in this country in the name of God or Jeebus or whatever every damned day that we live and walk. Every damned day. I'm not taking a thing away from the success of the LGBT mobilization and keeping issues public and getting support. But maybe we should all spare a little time for some of these other marginalized people who are even more marginalized, perhaps. Not that it's an issue of how much. The fact that it is enough. But if the poor people of color in this country do not have advocates, if the poor women of color in this country do not have advocates, if the poor immigrants of this country do not have advocates, maybe our advocates could spend a little time working on it. Maybe we could spend a little time paying attention and stirring the pot on these issues. Maybe. Maybe. The second case out of Indiana is kind of interesting. This involves Governor Pence and the HIV epidemic that's currently going on down there in, I believe it's Scott County. One county of Indiana is about 90 cases. They've spiked about 90 new cases of HIV, which is a very huge incidence number. And most of these people are injecting drug users. So what Governor Pence has had to do is he rescinded for 30 days the state law against needle exchange programs for drug users. Well, let's look at the case here for a minute. First of all, why is there injecting drug use to such levels in rural Indiana? Well, it's because it's gotten hard and extremely expensive to get oxys. So people who got addicted to painkillers for whatever reason, and a lot of them are not recreational, people who get addicted to narcotic painkillers like oxys, who then can't get them or find them so expensive, find that heroin is cheaper. And if you want the bang for your buck, you're going to hit heroin. You're going to spike it. You're going to inject it. Some people smoke it. Some people snort it. But the bang for your buck is intravenous injection. Now, needles, injecting needles, are hard to come by in places like Indiana, where they're tightly controlled because they want to stop those nasty drug users from using them. Well, here's a news flash, Indiana. They're going to inject anyway. And what they will commonly do is they will share the kit. Not just the needle, they'll share the spoon, they'll share the cotton wad that they're straining it through, they'll share the whole kit. And if you want to transmit a disease, especially a blood-borne disease, there are very few ways better to do it than sharing needles. So here's Governor Pence, who sees this case and it's breaking in the newspapers. It's a big deal. They got 90 cases of HIV in one county. So he rescinds the law for a little while. Just for a little while. Not for very long, mind you. Just for a little bit. So 30 days. They can get a week's supply of needles for 30 days. Well, that's not enough needles, and they're still going to be shared. But what's going on? It's reached a point for Governor Pence that it's all over the news. So he can't pretend it's not happening, but it was happening before. Maybe it wasn't an HIV epidemic, but it was epidemics of hepatitis C, of hepatitis B, of all kinds of interesting little viruses and bacteria that can be transmitted through injecting drugs. It was all of these. They were happening. They weren't on the front page of the paper. They weren't costing the state, obviously, or going to cost the state millions of dollars in care. But they were happening. And they were costing the state millions of dollars in care. It's just they're not picked up. They're not as, not necessarily, hepatitis C and hepatitis B are not necessarily as virulent in the early forms. You may not see damage happening. You may not even be testing people for them. So all this was going on. And here's the interesting bit. Needle exchanges are effective, proven, low-cost remedies to infections spread by injecting drug use. They are needle exchanges. People are going to use drugs. Governor Pence doesn't want to admit that. Governor Pence thinks he's encouraging drug use by allowing needle exchanges. Brain flash, Gov. Where the hell do you think they got these infections? They were using it anyway. And clean needles would have prevented a lot of these cases. But he says, he's not okay with needle exchange. No. He's not okay. But when enough people suffer, when it rises to be a public problem, then he's okay. And despite the fact there are decades of excellent research from Australia, from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from places in the U.S., there's stacks of evidence that needle exchange is an effective, low-cost way of harm minimization, which is a radical idea for American public health, at least in Republican states, harm minimization to the public at large. Despite all that, it seems obvious that the governor and the majority of the voters in Indiana are not interested in reality or truth or facts or even fairness. Not even interested. They're interested in maintaining a lie about their own goodness and their own righteousness, but it's a lie that is paid for through the suffering of others. It's a lie that's paid for by the imprisonment of poor women of color, that is paid for by the denial of programs that would seriously improve the public health of the state. It is a lie so common and yet so vile that I'm reminded of the advice of John Quincy Adams, who proposed that non-slave holding states should secede from the Union. in order to create a more nearly perfect human contract. As William A. Williams put it, a more human community, the bargain between freedom and slavery, Adams asserted, as early as 1920, I'm quoting this all from Williams, is morally and politically vicious. The bargain between freedom and slavery is morally and politically vicious. It robs the poor, the unfortunate, the helpless of their elementary rights. And it does. Just like the IDUs have been robbed of their elementary rights, the way women of color are robbed of their elementary rights. It robs the poor, the unfortunate, and the helpless. Adams goes on, the secession in the cause of freedom would be traumatic, demanding, and dangerous, but I dare not say that it is not to be desired. And William A. Williams' comment on this was, there is tough talk, not heard today. Not heard today on the left. Tough talk, not heard today on the left. So now we're getting close to the heart of the matter. The whole key of the show. Adams is talking about the bargain between freedom and slavery. We got a lot of bargains that are being made in this culture. We've got the bargain between empire and democracy. Another morally and politically vicious bargain. We have the bargain between freedom and slavery in this country still. And we have a bargain between privilege and equality. Morally and politically vicious. Right? And we all complain about this, especially folks on the left. They all complain about these bargains that we maintain, funded by lies and funded by the manipulation of the least privileged among us. We all bitch about it. The left bemoans their loss of a representative seat in government. And far too many of what Gore Vidal would have called the right wing of our unitary corporate politics have embraced the canard that granting of what they see as special rights strips them of their rights. Granting these special rights to poor black women who miscarry, or to injecting drug users, or to people of a different sexual orientation, or to people with a different religion. That granting rights to these people strips the privilege away from the Republicans, away from the white privileged male Christian bulwark of this country. That's how they see it. They have this canard. The word is apissu. That if we grant what they think are special rights to these other folks, they're not special rights. They're ordinary rights. They're equal rights. And yes, it will strip you of some of your power. It will strip you precisely of some of your privilege to exercise rights that other people may not freely exercise. Governor Pence and good people of Indiana. It will indeed. But we see this privilege everywhere, and especially in this country. All of our tough talk about egalitarianism and freedom and equality, it's a lie. We'll get to that in a minute. Consider the privilege demanded by the doctors and the government officials and the others associated with Johns Hopkins, who are now being sued because they injected children and prison inmates and psychiatric patients with sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis, in the 1940s and 50s. Now think about this. Children, prison inmates, and psychiatric patients. The poorest, weakest, least empowered people around. In a poor, weak, least empowered country of Guatemala. This is where the holders of this great privilege misused it and injected them with sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis, in experiments that rival those conducted by Nazi doctors. From Johns Hopkins. It puts one in mind of the Tuskegee experiments, that atrocity where African Americans were likewise injected with sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis, and were not told, nor in some cases treated. And then the doctors sat around and they watched them die because they wanted to study tertiary syphilis, stage 3 of syphilis, where the people become demented, they become paralyzed, and then they die. Tell me that's not privilege. And I hear apologists, especially older folks, like my parents' age. I hear apologists talk about these things. Well, times were different back in the 40s and 50s, and people had different values back then, and we didn't see things the same way. No, that too is a lie. Another lie from our alcoholic country. The times and the people are the same, and the values and beliefs are the same. Same as it ever was. The racism is the same. The misogyny is the same. The utter disregard for the rights of others is the same. We cannot become a good people without recognizing ourselves as who we are and abandoning the bad faith of our existence. Bad faith. Jean-Paul Sartre defined bad faith. You lie first to yourself, and then you lie to others. And then you lie to others. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Long Waves Radio on KYRS. I'm Gary, and we're talking about the alcoholic syndrome of America's unable to recognize itself and to change its behavior. We're in denial, just like alcoholics. We lie to ourselves first, and then we lie to others. And like any practiced person in denial, these denials are elaborate, they're smooth, they can be delivered trippingly off the tongue, and being made in bad faith, they allow the most amazing leaps of logic and philosophy. We're doing this in the name of science. We're doing this to protect our morals of the country. We're doing this to ensure that Christians don't feel like their religion doesn't matter. Elaborate and well-practiced denials. Indiana is all about the rights of fetuses, fetae. Not because they have any cogent idea or facts or even philosophical truths, and certainly no history. I mean, they love to drag out the religion card on this to show how much they care about babies, how much they care. As long as they're not black, as long as they're not poor, as long as their folks aren't injecting drug users, as long as they're not Muslims. Okay, I think we're defining the group you do actually care about. It's people like you who share your privilege. That, Governor Spence, is not a democracy. Governor Pence, my bad. And it's not, I shouldn't beat up on Indiana. A lot of states are like this, and a lot of people are like this, a great many. But the arguments, about abortion and fetuses, they're not about the unborn child. They're about setting personal prejudice against women into law under the protection of poorly cherry-picked scriptural arguments. Poorly cherry-picked scriptural arguments. Right? I mean, the devil, too, can quote Scripture when it serves his purpose, as the saying goes. And the Bible says much more about the occasional necessity and even the joy of murdering infants than it says against LGBT people. And it certainly doesn't say much bad about the poor, especially not the New Testament. But you get into that Old Testament, you get into that old Hebraic, made up, borrowed, cobbled together oral tradition with that Hebrew sky god. And there's a great joy and necessity in murdering, and especially murdering infants when it's called upon. Numbers 31:15, where they're told, the Hebrews are told to kill the midnight women, well, at least the women who haven't seen a penis. and take the rest for slaves. If they're virgins, take them for slaves. Otherwise, kill all the women. So, 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. Go and attack the Amalek. Kill man and woman, infant and nursing child. Well, that certainly sounds happy. Psalms 137:9. Happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us, he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Well, I mean, if you read this kind of stuff regularly, I'm pretty sure you come away with the sense that you're not all about protecting the babies. No, sir, you're not. And this is always a problem with cherry-picking scriptures, and especially taking them literally for one's own political or personal purposes. And this is exactly what I contend people do who want to hold up the Bible and talk about how much they love the babies. All this Old Testament killing and genocide, this is Bronze Age thinking. These are Bronze Age values. Vengeance, murder, genocide. Bronze Age. You can't pick and choose which values you want to have and which ones you want to ignore in taking your arguments from the Scripture, right? But in taking their arguments from the Scriptures, people show that they do indeed have these Bronze Age values. Murder, vengeance, suicide. Genocide. Excuse me, I got that completely wrong. Murder, vengeance, genocide. Maybe it is suicide ultimately. You know, as Carl Jung put it, scratch a modern man a quarter inch and you'll find a savage. And this is savage. The Bronze Age Hebrews were in many ways a very savage and ruthless, bloodthirsty people. As are we. We are savages. It's in our blood. It's in our history. It's in our old stories of goodness and truth. We're savages. Truly. I wanted to talk a little bit about some new studies that have recently emerged about Iraq and about the Middle East. I'm trying desperately hard to find them among my stacks of paper. There's been a new set of studies released just recently. I'm going to have to parse these a bit, showing that the numbers of people who have died at the hands of U.S. and U.S. coalition forces in the Middle East and in Afghanistan is a lot higher than most people believe or would think. How many folks, off the top of your head, how many people do you think have died in Iraq? This is a country of some 33 million. The number is probably, just since the 90s, probably about 3 million. So what's that, 1 in 11? No, it's 10%. 3 million. So 10% of the population has died. Afghanistan, the numbers are similar for a country of a similar population, about 30 million in Afghanistan. Numbers are similar. These were assembled by Physicians for Social Responsibility, who looked at a lot of different sources of fatalities and deaths. And this is what they came up with. These are the numbers they came up with. 1.7 million Iraqi children, this is UN numbers, 1.7 million Iraqi children died as a direct result of the U.S. sanctions under William Jefferson Clinton's administration after George H.W. Bush had bombed, after our little war, chasing the Iraqis out of Kuwait. The U.S. bombed some of the Iraqi infrastructure, particularly sewage plants and water treatment plants. And then part of the sanctions was we refused to let them purchase the equipment and the chemicals to reestablish water purification on a large scale. 1.7 million children died, almost all of them under the age of 5, all of them by easily preventable diseases. Diseases that wouldn't have occurred at all if they had been able to get the materials, that we denied them. So we could be talking about numbers as high as 6 million throughout the region, maybe as high as 10, 6 to 10 million. That's a nice kind of roundish figure. People slain as a result of U.S. actions overseas. We are savages. Who lets children die? Who sets conditions in place and lets children die? And we did know about it. Madeleine Albright, U.S. Secretary of State under William Jefferson Clinton, was asked if she knew about these staggeringly high deaths of Iraqi children, and she said, yes, we thought it was an acceptable loss. Well, they weren't your children now, were they, Ms. Albright? Or you might have had a different tune. We're savages. It's in our blood. Think about what it would mean if 10% of the U.S. population was killed over let's say a 10-year span. So we'd be talking about, we got about, 330 million. So let's say maybe 30 million, 33 million Americans killed. That'd be an acceptable loss, right? That'd be an acceptable loss. Savage as we are, it's in our blood, it's in our history, it's in our stories. This is the truth we must repress and deny to maintain our delusional belief that we are good and that we are kind. Sitting in a church pew or pretending to does not make goodness. Quoting Bible verses does not make goodness. Striving for goodness makes goodness. Striving with your might to make goodness makes goodness. But we don't do that. Now, you and I, we may not be murderers. I hope we're not. I know I'm not directly anyway. But we do ignore the unjust murder of others, especially children. Where was the Republican outcry over these 1.7 million children in Iraq? Where? Where's the Republican outcry over these 10 million killed in the Middle East wars? Where? Who mourns these children? Who mourns these civilians? Who mourns these soldiers? Who mourns the destruction of whole cities, of whole civilizations at our hands? We ignore it. We ignore this unjust killing, and worse, many among us support it. And we support governments who lie to us, and we encourage their lies, for they tell us what we want to hear. Just like the alcoholic who gets told he doesn't really have a problem. They tell us the lies we want to hear. We're a good country. We're good people. We try hard. We work hard. We built this country. We stole this country. And a great portion of our wealth we stole through our acquisition of empire. Let's quit patting ourselves on the back. Well, you know we have an election cycle upcoming next year. And it's going to be so interesting. It will be as if the heavens have opened and manure rains from the sky. Pleasing lies, pleasant lies, lies of self-aggrandizement, the lies of codependence covering up for us, and the lies of enablers helping us to maintain our fantasies of goodness. This is what we've got to look forward to. And these lies of empire and power are exactly the ones we want to hear as a nation. These lies of empire and power. How tough we are. How extensive our control is. How we can just blow people up. As Michael Ledeen once said, sometimes the United States just has to pick up some little dirtbag country and throw it against the wall to show the rest of them we mean business. And I can think of a number of people off the top of my head who would think that an admirable statement. Who would think that an admirable position to assume? Yeah, we got to be tough. We got to blow people up and take care of these bad guys. You mean like Al-Qaeda? We made Al-Qaeda. We did. We made ISIS. ISIS was created in the prisons of Iraq after the U.S. got there. That's where these people got radicalized. Where do radicals come from? For the most part, from oppression. That's where radicals come from. And as to Al-Qaeda, let's see. We're supporting them in Syria and bombing them in Iraq? I mean, what? Does this make any sense to anybody? But empire and power, these are the lies we want to hear. Republican parties never met a war it didn't like. Not in the last 50 years anyway. I'm not even sure about that. They undermined the treaty with Iran. They are so in bed with Bibi Netanyahu that they can't even do what's right for their own country, not to speak of the rest of the world. And what do they talk about? They talk about more war, the expansion of war. Now, maybe this is just part of the circus act of scaring people and then producing a war for the big defense contracts who, we must admit it, have taken our role in the legislatures. Right? Legislatures don't represent us. They represent big corporations, especially defense corporations. These corporations can't vote, but they can sure as hell buy. So, maybe that's just part of the circus act. The Republicans, talk of war. It's raw meat to the crowd because they're scared and they feel threatened because they've been told that they're threatened. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go over there and kick somebody's butt and yay. And they also get kudos from the big defense contractors who will continue to support them. I mean, how else do we make sense out of the senselessness of the Middle East? There is no policy there. This is all ad hoc. They're making this up as they go. This is all tactics. There is no policy. And this isn't just me saying. This was also Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff for many years, and including his years in the Bush White House. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson says there is no policy in the Middle East for the U.S. It's just continuing an endless, mindless war of destruction. And meanwhile, millions die. Meanwhile, our wealth, our treasure is squandered. Meanwhile, our men and women are killed. Meanwhile, we sink deeper and deeper and deeper into the depravity of denial. What contortions of reality and historical fact must occur for us to believe that the role of the U.S. has been what we claimed? Forming democracies? That worked out so well in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, and in Libya. It was always a lie. It's never been what the U.S. has been about. Give me an example and I will show you the counter. So, we said we were forming democracies. Well, we've already abandoned, really, largely, even saying that's what we're doing. We're just fighting terror now, stopping terrorists. Well, that makes no sense at all. Really, it makes no sense at all. If we could just admit it's about stealing other people's resources and destroying any local control, we'd be a lot closer to the truth. But nobody can say the emperor has no clothes. Nobody can say this is what empires do. This is what empires have always done, especially our empire. Here's another quote from William Appleman Williams. This was published in The Nation, August 2nd, 1980. Let's start with a definition of empire. The use and abuse and the ignoring of other people for one's own welfare and convenience. America was born and bred of empire. This does not mean that we are unique, indeed just the opposite. We are different only because we acquired the empire at a very low cost, because the rewards have been enormous, and because until now we have masked our imperial truth with the rhetoric of freedom. Make no mistake about it, the imperial way of life produced the promised rewards. It generated great economic wealth and effectively limited social discontent. But we must also report the costs. I do not for a moment dismiss the people killed and the property stolen, but I would suggest that the greatest price was paid in the coin of our sensitivity about what we were doing and how that was understood by other people. We were already assuming that our right to security transcended the traditional right to defend what we had and had become the right to perfect security in any imaginable future contingency. We began to define security as the natural right to empire. Americans became so habituated to empire. Americans became so habituated to empire as the price of freedom that they demanded ever more freedom and ever more empire. William Appleman Williams, one of the lesser-known historians who was so important and so astute at the things he did. So then, what must we do? What must we do? What? How refreshing it is, Williams wrote, to turn to a grandchild of John Quincy Adams, Henry Adams, who observed that attempts to impose uniformity upon a continent might easily, if not certainly, produce more corruption and other evils than the wickedness commonly ascribed to diversity. He concluded his evaluation with the judgment the old system had collapsed, and the refusal to imagine and to create a new social compact meant that 9/10 of men's political energies must henceforth be wasted on expedients to piece out, to patch, or in vulgar language to tinker the political machine as often as it broke down. And it has surely been breaking down. It has surely been breaking down. Williams continues in another vein. I want to change the system. I could not care less about the corporations and the Pentagon. We can create a different economic system, and we have enough bombs to ensure our security while we revive virtue, that positive passion for the common good. I want to invent a new way for individuals and groups of citizens to use technology. It is not so much that small is good as that small is human, and I'm willing to tolerate a degree of inefficiency in order to allow people to make their own mistakes, to practice democracy on the job, and to create an educational system that informs people that they can learn as much from reading Shakespeare and William Blake as becoming a master slave of Apple, Texas Instruments, or IBM, or a pawn of the state, immunized to freedom and liberty. Immunized to freedom and liberty by the placebo of power. He continues, in short, I have chalked my cue. I have come to play the only game in town. I want to transform the crisis of democracy into a true crisis. Or as the good folks at Crime Think, an anarchist group, are fond of saying, to change everything, start anywhere. To change everything, start anywhere. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. You can contact me by writing longwaves at kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Longwaves Radio. Shows are podcast. Links are on Facebook, or you can just put it in quotes, Longwaves Radio. And I'm going to do one more disclaimer here and say that the opinions expressed on this show are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And you are listening to KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on the FM day. I'm going to give you Seize the Day, an English group singing, I think, a very prescient song called United States. Till next week, stay strong, stay smart. Bye-bye.
On the day the market fell, it could have been a candy store in Kandahar as well. And she might have been a Muslim, but it's kinda hard to tell when your body's ground to zero and your skin's been fried to hell. So tell me it's a war to end all war, or don't tell me nothing. 'Cause if this sacrifice is not for peace, it was not worth making. Seemed to me you did your best to put your hand in the hornet nest that bit you. Just when it hit you, there's other people hurt as much as you. And grief is no excuse for what you do. High flyers at the corporations, daisy cutting heads. They hold each other's hands and plummet from the window ledge. And the monitors have mounted on the coffee deal, which meant 5,000 farmers wondering where their livelihood just went. America, my family, the whole world feels your pain. And before this war is over, you'll make sure we do again. Even as the tower tumbled on their firefighting team, we wondered who you'd barbecue for puncturing your dream. So tell me it's a war to end all war, or don't tell me nothing. 'Cause if this sacrifice does not bring peace, it was not worth making. Seemed to me you did your best to put your hand in the hornet nest that bit you, but it still don't hit you. There's other people feel as much as you. And freedom's no excuse for what you do. I am not an Islamicist, religion's not my thing. But they're friendlier than Christians and I like the way they sing. And I want my sisters free to burn the burqa if they choose. Not lie awake and calculate what weight they need to lose. So tell me it's a war to end all war, or don't tell me nothing. 'Cause if this sacrifice don't change the world, it was not worth making. Seemed to me you did your best to put your hand in the hornet nest that bit you. When will it hit you? There's other people need as much as you. And greed is no excuse for what you do. You're beautiful, big-hearted, in many ways you're free. You're smart enough to get the world how you want it to be. So it's hard for me to tell you what you shouldn't have to hear. Your nation is that terrorist most human beings fear. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia, and Nam, Cambodia, Grenada, Chile, and Afghanistan, Palestinian and Iraqi, and some more you never knew. United States of people who deserved as much as you. So tell me that you don't support this war, or don't tell me nothing. 'Cause if this song of mine don't change your heart, it was not worth singing. But I believe you did your best, chasing life and happiness. Never wondered, never guessed how the news had been suppressed of a never-ending killing fest. Ripped the kid from the mama's breast, shrapnel through her daddy's chest, while we're all singing glory, hallelujah. I'm talking to you. Somebody made a killing in your name. So take your power back or take the blame.